choke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up, trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day.
Well, hello there folks, and welcome back once again to Kilohearts. George here with a very special video. We're going to do a complete mix breakdown of this here track and have a lot of fun along the way. So a couple of weeks ago in a video about Faturator, you heard this. And last week in a video about ladder filter and phaser, you heard these things. All of those sounds and more are in this project here, Cybergrime it's called, partly in celebration of our Cybergrime sale, in which for a limited time you can get 50% off Faturator, phaser, ladder filter and distortion. Great products which are used in this project. You can go and check them out on our website, buy them up if you haven't already, great sounding things. But also in addition to that inspiration, just the general inspiration of creativity. We wanted to sit down, take some time to work with the Kilohearts products and really get to know them in the real world, making a whole track from start to finish. So here that track is, and if you want to be here to the finish, why not subscribe to this channel? You can do that now. Click the subscribe button, the notification bell, and don't forget to like the video. It's easy to forget, but it gives us a little boost with the algorithm, helps the video get seen. So just take a second and click the like button now. I reckon we can get over 100 likes on this video if we work together as a team. I believe in us. So one more little piece of business before we start. My usual disclaimer that I'm not really here to teach you anything as such necessarily, just to share with you what we've been up to share some inspiration, some creativity, and get your thoughts thinking. And I'm as likely as you to learn anything from the process, I reckon. So if you've got any thoughts, leave them in the comments and tell me what you would do differently, what you would do if you were producing, engineering, mixing this track. What would you add to make it even better? Let's get a little creative conference going on in the comments. So without further ado, let's dive right in and get on with the anatomy of this mix. So yeah, let's take a look at the basic anatomy of this mix to begin with. It's got a couple of main influences. There's a kind of UK grime thing going on.
Roll up, choke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up, trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day, trying to ease this rage. I sleep with my demons, I see when they aim and it takes on the stage, shooting invaders, chapter ends on a burn this page.
With two great rappers. That was Hybrid MP, one of my old buddies from the UK, as well as a local artist from right here in Sweden, my good friend Siri.
Yeah, your heart's already broken, bro. Got it from me, wanna wish upon the star you want me. Wanna boy this rocket, now you're grown all alien. Why I glow up radiant light, just from the state you're in. I watch you was from this.
It's a theme of this mix, as you'll see through this video, that there's a lot of value in variety and breadth of sound. So those are two contrasting sounds in the verse sections. Then we have these choruses, these hooks that I'm singing in, which are kind of space oddity, kind of psychedelia sound, I suppose. And that happens a couple of times. There's a longer one over here to the right before a little outro. So those are the fundamental sections of the song. What are the fundamental sounds of the song? Well, let's start by building things up from the bottom. We've got this kick and this sub. There's a sort of lead bass synth sound. Which repeats. We've got this resonator sound that we discussed briefly in the video a couple of weeks ago. Let's build up the drum kit a bit with a snare and a clap. And hat. We'll touch more on the toms later on. And then there's this phase plant instance here, which I actually intended just to use as a placeholder to kind of map out some of the chords before adding the parts in collage, but I left it in because I ended up keeping it very subtle by side chaining. So that actually is a sound in phase plant that's just a nice simple pad. With the trance gate making things nice and choppy. But in Snap Heap here I've built a little system just with the gain and the input envelope And this is taking an external sidechain source from the kick drum, and it's using that to just drive the gain of the sound coming through. And that's obviously adjustable with these envelope controls here. It couldn't be more simple, could it? But that keeps that kind of bulk out of the way while still giving you just the sensation of those chords. So I decided to leave it in the end, and that makes up the kind of rhythm section with all those other pieces that I showed you. So that sounds like this. Oh, and I mustn't forget this high lead part, which we discussed last week. That's really important, because one of the watch points of this mix for me was to try and make the best use of the full frequency spectrum, the full height of the frequency spectrum. So while there are a few key elements that are in the heart of things, the vocal obviously, then that respace here, this sound that's recurring, it's very mid-rangey. Almost everything else is either very low frequency or very high frequency focused. We're probably going to spend the majority of this video on that high frequency stuff, but let's first take a look at what we've done to the low end. So the low end, to all intents and purposes, is made up of two elements, this kick and this sub. And let's start just with a before and after in the context of the mix on that low end. So this is before with no processing. And this is after. It's amazing the difference it makes just having everything tightened up and put in its place. So what have we done? Well, let's start with the individual tracks. The kick has basically an EQ and a limiter doing the work. We talked about Facturator in a previous video. Without the Facturator, it sounds completely different. But that's not really so much part of the low end processing as just part of the sound design on that kick. So let's leave that. The big changes come from Slice EQ. That's taking out some resonant frequencies in the low mids, boosting the very low end around the fundamental, and then a bit of a peak where that click of the beta comes. That adds impact and takes away some of the mud that will get in the way of that sub bass. And then a limiter to make sure that everything's really tight and performing to its best before we go over to the sub bass, which is essentially a phase plant preset with the addition of a couple of distortion snap-ins. Let's just listen to the difference those distortion snap-ins make. They add all the nastiness. So that sound goes into multipass, where I've split the frequencies at 566 and made everything low mono. Without it, it sounds like this, which on its own is fine, but it's very wide in the mix. If we mono the lows and let the highs go wider, we will hear that it sits much better in the mix. Slice EQ does much the same as we did to the kick, removes that resonant area around where the kick drum is going to be doing its work, and adds some beef and heft down low. And then a compressor finally, which is sidechained to the kick drum to duck this sub sound away when the kick drum hits. Otherwise, they'll fight for space. So then we go over to the sub bus, which is here, and we have three plugins, just three simple things going on. A Slice EQ doing more of the same, but a broader approach. It's taking away some of the mid-frequency mud, that low sort of boxy frequencies in the mids, boosts the low end. We want lots of power and sub, takes out some of the very, very low sub, because that's not going to be ultimately useful on the master bus, and then just adds a little bit of air to those high overtones that we produced with the distortion plugins. Then moving into multipass, where I think most of the fun happens, three different dynamics plugins doing three different things to three different sections of the frequency spectrum. The very low lows are getting some glue compression with a very fast attack, just to make sure that all the sounds are present no matter what the volume. And again, depending on what system you're listening on, that's going to be very subtle, but it will make the presence of that very, very low end much more constant in the mix. In the mid-range, slow attack compression, that's to add punch and attack to the sound, letting the transients slip through and then hitting the rest of the sound with a high ratio. Has a big effect on the overall impact of that section of the frequency range. And of course, that's where we took out a lot of frequency information with the EQs, so we're not hearing those boxy frequencies pushed. Then in the higher range, we have some soft, gentle, fast attack compression like we did on the lows, but with a very low threshold so that everything gets glued back together, sits nicely into the mix. And that helps us avoid that kind of tappy, knocky high end. Finally, a simple glue compressor over everything just to make sure that the kick and the sub sit together nicely. And all of these are very subtle changes, but they add up to make a lot more space in the mix for the other elements. Let's listen to a before and after one more time. And speaking of other elements, one of the key other elements, especially alongside the low end, is this kind of low-mid respace, this lead bass here. And a lot of time and energy in this mix has gone on to making this as aggressive and edgy as possible. It all starts in Phase Plant, in fact, with a slightly adjusted version of a preset called Dangerous Territory by Artifacts. Everything on the left is more or less untouched, but I've added a couple of things on the right hand side here in the effects lanes. Let's look at this instance of Multipass, which is doing essentially some dynamic EQ. It's a dynamics plugin on just the kind of high mid band, and this was a tip that I got from MSM Engineer in London, who's a guy who's really pretty big in the UK grime scene, has produced and engineered records for all kinds of people, Skepta, Wiley, you name it. And he suggested that some dynamics work on the high mids in this kind of a bass sound would really bring out the punch and the bite and the edge to bring it to life. So without this dynamics plugin, it sounds like this. And with, really makes that did it cut a little bit more, doesn't it? So that's a cool tip. And then we see our old friend Phaser here adding a bit of dimension to the sound. Without Phaser, it sounds like this. A little static, isn't it? And with Phaser here, it starts to move and bring life to the party. Good old Phaser, I like Phaser. But once you get your low end in order, you also want to extend the frequency spectrum up to the top. And that's something we took some time over on this mix too. So let's move on to talk about higher frequencies and sweetening. Now, sweetening is a word that Graham Cochran from the Recording Revolution likes to use to describe the final touches that make a mix really exciting. Those little bits of ear candy that aren't fundamental to the mix. Maybe they only occur once or twice in the mix, but they really bring it to life. Things like this individual lasers sound, which comes in just once in the second verse. Direct from the Andrew Huang Phase Plant content bank. It's a sound called Laser Faller, and it just does. I don't think I did anything to that except use it. It's a terrific sound. But also things like this rise here, which is a sound from Phase Plant also. It's actually a sampled sound from the Impossible content bank from Audiction. Lots of interesting samples in there. And this is based on something called Granular Glitch. That, in conjunction with the impact that lives alongside it, sounds like this. And that impact kind of takes the place of a crash cymbal in this track. We've also got this second resonator instance. We talked about the resonator that we're building in Phase Plant a couple of weeks ago. That just appears once during the second hook section to give 3 notes that sound like this. Those little things, those high frequency tastes can just bring an extra openness to a track. It can really raise the ceiling. So that just literally contributes this. And in addition to the high frequency string sound itself, I've also done one of my favorites, a sort of a pitch shifted shimmer reverb type thing in Snap Heap. But I think of all the sweetening we've done here, my favorite and the most interesting thing is what we've done with the 808 toms. Let's take a listen to them in the context of the track first.
Times across me, all the sleepless nights it cost me. I was long and hoping, barely hoping why you closed.
And without the effects that we've added, they sound like this. What we've done in Snap Heap is basically take an enormous rough file to them and make them nasty as all heck. And we've achieved that with distortion and saturator and ladder filter and a bit of reverb as well. So let's talk through this, because I think this is an interesting bit of ear candy. It really adds depth and grit to the track that isn't there throughout, because I didn't want to use too much reverb, I didn't want to use too much ambient depth, but just these little moments of nasty, dirty reverb make a big difference. So the first thing we're doing is adding distortion, and without it, it sounds like this, as I say. I've chosen, I think, the nastiest, most aggressive form of distortion available in the distortion plugin, Quantize, which adds this sound. It is not tasteful in any sense, but it is effective and quite mean. So mixed halfway and with just the tiniest bit of bias, that changes the quality of the sound completely, makes it much more colourful and character-filled. And then the next thing we do is send that through ladder filter with a relatively high cutoff. This is mostly just taking the very, very roughest digital top edge off that and then saturating with this lovely analog style drive. So that changes the quality of our distortion more than anything. And then the really interesting thing, I think, is over on the right hand side, these 2 parallel channels. One is sending that sound we've just heard through unaffected. The other is a kind of a distorted gated reverb type style thing. So full mix on this reverb plugin gives us nothing but reverb. The reverb itself sounds like this. And because we're adding saturator to it, just the reverb rather than to the whole sound, we get a very, very shashy background, a very dirty ambience that sounds like those toms are coming crackling through from another dimension. And then when we add that original dry sound in, we get this. It's very kind of rough and spacesuit tinfoil sort of sound going on there. I kind of like it. And again, in the context of the track, just adds a lot of depth that we've saved ourselves from in the generality of the track. We don't want too much wash, but we just want those moments of ambience to remind ourselves that we're in the enormity of outer space.
Times across me, all the sleepless nights it cost me. I was long and hoping, barely hoping why you clock.
An effective little sweetener, I think. One other example is in the vocals here. We've got a lot of different interjections and just little moments that Thierry has added in to make the thing catch your ear as you move through. It's not just a delivery, but it's also a performance. Like, for example, a little gang hey here.
What you was forgetting is just suffering your galaxy fallacies that you relish your analysis.
And the way that the panning creates a sense of space in the hooks here. Just got things popping up in one place, in another, moving from one place to another, just to remind the listener that there's a whole wide world out there. And even the addition of that space countdown at the beginning.
Ready for takeoff. 3, 2.
Roll up, talk up, yeah, roll up.
It's not necessary as such to the thrust and the narrative of the track, but it does add a little bit of theatricality, and you can't go wrong with these kinds of things. It's a lot harder than you would think to overdo it, And since we've come on to the vocals, why don't we take a look at what we've done in the mix for the vocals?
Roll up, toke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up. Trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day.
So there's 3 vocalists in this track, me in the hooks here, and then Siri and Hybrid MP in the verses. And that's a cool opportunity to sort of showcase the width of our variety. But actually that doesn't necessarily mean a super different approach to mixing. Both of the rap vocals in this track I've treated relatively similarly, with obviously minor tweaks to suit the frequency content of the voices. So let's start with Hybrid MP.
Roll up, toke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up. Trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day, trying to ease this rage.
And there's a couple of key things going on here. First of all, EQ, taking out some resonant frequencies which pop up in any vocal recording. If you've recorded it in a real room in the real world, you'll get these slightly whistling frequencies. Let's hear just one of them. Let's take this one here.
Roll up, toke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up. Trying to numb this pain, I feel insane.
We don't want that. Or this one, for example.
Roll up, toke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up. Trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day.
There will just be a few little frequencies through that spectrum that resonate and that create an unpleasantness that you don't want to amplify. So what this is about is getting rid of stuff you don't want before you then boost and enhance all the stuff that you do. And that's what I'm doing here with this quite big peak up in the higher frequencies to add some cut and bite, and then a very, very big boost on the top end. I'm starting to get less and less afraid of boosting the high end of vocals, because a lot of air can be a really good thing if you control it sensibly. And the change is quite a drastic one from the original unaffected recorded sound. Let's just hear it soloed without any effects.
Roll up, toke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up. Trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day, trying to ease this.
It's not a bad sound, but it is remarkably muffled in comparison to this.
Roll up, toke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up. Trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day, trying.
So that's a little bit of improvement. And if we go over to some of Siri's vocals, we'll hear that I've done roughly the same thing.
Already broken brown. Got it from me, wanna wish upon the star you want me. Wanna boy this rocket, now you grown all lately and why I go by.
And in addition, a big shelf down low as well, just to pump up the fundamental down there. Very similar approach with obviously different details, but without it sounds like this.
Already broken brown. Got it from me, wanna wish upon the star you want me. Wanna boy this rocket, now you grown up.
And with just that bold use of EQ, it's so much more kind of radio ready or whatever. The next thing I've done on both vocals is a pair of compressors, one with slow attack for the transients to come through and really bring some more sizzle and bite to the track.
Already broken brown. Got it from me, wanna wish upon the star you want me. Wanna boy this rocket, now you grown all lately and
Especially in rap, I think it's very important that you get the percussive attack of your consonants in there. So I wanted to hear a lot more of that. That's what that compressor does for us. You could also use transient shaper. The next compressor is fast attack, and that's gluing things back together, bringing some evenness and some control to the sound after accentuating the transients. It's important, I think, to do it in that order.
already broken brown. Got it from me, wanna wish upon the star you want me.
Because if you do it the other way round, you make the transients too like with the body of the sound, and you end up with a smooshy sound that you can't then accentuate. So you need to accentuate the transients first and then build the power of the main body of the words. So without that compressor,
already broken brown. Got it from me, wanna
it's a
wish
little
upon
thin.
the star you want me. Wanna boy this rocket, now you grown all lately and why I go up radiant light.
And now the main flow of the sound is held up, buoyed up by that compressor. And finally, on both vocals, let's go back to Hybrid MP's vocals at the beginning, just to demonstrate the effectiveness of the limiter. Took me a long time to be brave enough to slap a limiter on the end of the vocal chain, but it works wonders. If you just let it kiss the threshold, it will do something wonderful to the sound. So without the limiter, sounds like this.
Roll up, toke up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up. Trying to numb this pain, I feel insane every day.
And
Trying to
with?
ease this rage, I sleep with my demons, I see when they aim and it takes on the stage, is shooting invaders. Chapter ends on a burn this page. I was just forever.
It's not an increase in volume as such, it's just an increase in presence that you kind of get for free with the limiter. If you just let the the volume rise to meet the threshold there, or bring the threshold down to meet your very highest peaks. Just tightens things up without losing any of that clarity that you've worked so hard to add. Same thing on series vocals here. Without the limiter. And with. I just want to show you one more little thing in the vocals. We talked about using Faturator in conjunction with the envelope follower in the video 2 weeks ago. This is exactly what I'm doing here on this vocal, as well as on my sung vocals in the hooks. So the incoming signal is providing the information to drive the mix of the Faturator, and that's got a lot of drive and distortion on it, so that the sound goes from this
Roll up, talk up, stressing out, now I'm smoked up.
to this.
This pain I feel insane every day, trying to ease this rage. I sleep with my demons, I see when they aim and it takes on the stage, is shooting.
Then of course there's the vocals in the hooks, and I just wanted to touch a little bit on what I did to those. You've heard them before in previous videos, but they've changed since. So we talked about getting Faturator involved in Snap Heap with that mix being driven by the envelope. But what we haven't talked about is the filtering that I'm doing in parallel over here on the right hand side. I've taken almost all the low and high frequencies out to make it sound more kind of telephonic, like it's traveling across light years through a radio. And I'm using an LFO tempo synced just to slightly modulate the position of that filter peak. But I think the most interesting thing of all about this vocal is what's happening behind it. This reverse reverb thing is an interesting little process that I wanted to talk about for a moment. So before you hear the vocal at all, you hear some sort of ghostly apparition. Again, to add to that interdimensional sense. And it's a pretty simple process, but quite an underused one, I think. What you do is you take your lead vocal, you duplicate it onto a separate track, which I've got right here, and you reverse that track and add lots of reverb. Then you bounce that sound down to another track, reverse it again, and what you have is the tail of the reverb preceding the sound of the vocal itself. And then, as I've done in Snap Heap here, you can use the sidechain input from the vocal itself to duck that sound so that it doesn't obscure the vocal itself, but you get that beautiful reverse incoming tail. And that works actually beautifully with the backing vocals to create a kind of off-kilter choir. So all of these little things just subtly elevate the track, just sweeten it. They're the cherry on the top, the icing, if you like. And they change the thing from a solid 4-square rhythm track into something a lot more interesting and a lot more ear-catching. Hopefully a lot more memorable. That's the whole thing, pretty much. We've talked about almost everything we could talk about. Just a quick reminder, I'm all ears for what you think. Tell us what you would add, what you would change. It's a discussion. We're here to chat and enjoy the creative process together. So if you loved it and you wouldn't change a thing, that's fine, tell us. But if you have any ideas, if this inspired any thought in you at all, leave us a comment and tell us what you're thinking. You'll be able to hear the final version of this track very soon. We're going to be publishing details about that imminently. And if you've got any projects on the go, why don't you tell us about those as well in the comments? We want to hear what you're doing with your Kilohearts plugins. We're also going to be bundling up this project file so that you can have a look at it yourself and running out some stems in case you want to do this in a different DAW. So hopefully you'll get to dissect this even further in your free time. Now all that remains to be said really is thanks very much for listening and checking this out. I hope you enjoyed going through this mix with me. I've enjoyed talking about it and I hope you'll enjoy listening to the finished track. Until next time, thanks very much and goodbye.